as Rodrigo said, I was born in Cuba, and my family took me to the United States when I was 8 or almost 9, and I lived in the States until I was 33. And by that time, I married a Cuban woman. Well, she was, when I met her, she was a student of psychology at the University of Habana. She had just graduated. I got her residency, and she came with me to Miami. We worked there for another 3 years. And after 3 years in Reagan's second term in office, I said, this is it. I'm getting out, and I have the ticket because my wife is Cuban from Cuba. She has family, and I can get the hell out. And I came to Cuba to live. Our daughter had already been born in Cuba, but we took her. My wife took her when she was 45 days old, and so we returned with our daughter. Then we had a son. My son is in LA. He's a filmmaker. And my daughter's here, and I have 2 grandchildren, and my wife's a psychologist. She's still at the University of Havana. She's a researcher, but she's also a professor. She's a researcher, and because of the influence of me and being there and everything, her area of study is Cuban migration abroad, particularly to the United States. So she's an expert in that area. And when I came back, I worked in a number of different positions in Cuba. It took me a lot to adapt. I was a lot more American than I wanted to admit. But I had my wife, I had my children, I had my wife's family was my support. And then I started to work in economic research. Then we created a company to import U.S. publications, because after the I remember Bergman Amendment, I believe, exempted informational products from the embargo, so we could purchase publications and export also Cuban publications to the U.S. So I did that for a few years, and my real pride was that was the year that the Cuban Central Library of Science and Technology was created at the Capitol. The Capitol building in Havana was not, as it is today, again, a legislative meeting place. It was, it was everything. And the Ministry of Science was there, and so they created the library. And the library had to purchase a lot of journals. 85% of scientific journals in the world are American. And they were launching biotechnology and pharmaceutical research and industry, and I got the job of getting all those subscriptions made in the U.S. There was no internet, there were no EBSCO and those companies that supply libraries today, and so I handled all that. We did a bunch of other stuff, a lot of it not exactly legal, considering the embargo. In fact, a lot of it not exactly legal, but we did all this, which was, and so my work helped inform the science community, particularly biotechnology and everything, and with all this information from the U.S. Scientific community, books and mostly journals. And then at one point, as I said, in Reagan's second term, things got really uncomfortable and risky, and I had a 1.5-year-old daughter and a wife that just couldn't settle in the U.S. She just didn't like it, and I was dying to come back to Cuba. I had no idea. I mean, I didn't really was ready to face the Cuban society, but I did. I came back, and then life began. And then in the last, I worked for about 10 years for the Canadian Urban Institute, and that took me all over the country. And I realized that Cuba was more than Havana, which was a great discovery, right? Going all over the country and working all over the country, and that's when I realized that if socialism was going to survive in Cuba, it couldn't just be done from the top down. It had to be built also from the bottom up. And that's when my whole concept of economics and changed, and I needed a theoretical background. So I went to look at social and solidarity economics, particularly Latin America, which was booming, and it was booming in response to neoliberal economics, to the the privatization, to everything else. It was like the people rising up, and the economists and the theoreticians given a theoretical baggage for this new movement from the bottom up and so on. And then I started to say, we need this in Cuba. And so, you see this bag here? It says here, well, it was a decentralization meeting, it was 2002 in Manila. And see how it's pretty 20 years of use. And that was a meeting that I went to with the Canadian Urban Institute on decentralization. And at that time, decentralization was equivalent to weakening the state. It was equivalent to giving responsibilities to the municipalities, but not the resources to do education, health, blah, blah, blah. And it was equivalent to privatization, and it was horrible. And it was seen totally horrible in Cuba. So I went there, despite all the bad jive and everything, which was true. And I realized that there was a lot of decentralization that we could do. It doesn't have to be the way the capitalists do it or the neoliberals do it. And this is what happened with the social and solidarity economy. There's a lot of things that we can do here, because even though we're a socialist economy, we're a socialist top-down economy. And the whole concept of social and solidarity economy is bottom-up. How we can build, in this case, how we can build socialism from the bottom up. And that's where I became enamored. And I came from one prohibited or disliked topic, which was decentralization, to the next disliked topic, which was social and solidarity economy. What are you talking about this? Well, we have a socialist economy. What do we need? And so now, 12 years later, 10 years after we started working in this area and created a network and so on, we published a second book. The first book was an academic success and a political flop. Wherever we went, we got, because it was the wrong message. It was not politically correct. So we published a second book, La economía social y solidaria en Cuba. Fundamentos y prácticas para el desarrollo socialista. The basis and practices for socialist development. And the whole idea is that we need social and solidarity economy for socialist development in Cuba, not for the way it's handled piecemeal and as a way of putting patches on capitalism in other countries, particularly Latin America. So now we're into this. We have political support, we have academic support, and we're very much into this as a complement to local development, as a way of giving tools to municipalities, to the central government, in terms of managing this whole process of decentralization, which is now okay, and strengthening the municipal government, strengthening the capacity to plan for development at the local level. But it has to be development that is inclusive. It has to be a development that takes into account the various economic players, which now, and we can talk about that if you want. The whole idea was that I was going to ask you ask me questions, and here I am blabbing on. But the diversification of the economic actors, particularly the rise of the small and medium-sized enterprises, has totally, invaded this country, which is great because we needed that. But that's also the threat. That's where the threat is. Because the threat is that you have a private sector that's going in the direction of capitalism, making money, and to hell with the society, because what we got to do is do as well as perform as well. And here's the socialist government and ideology and everything else in the other direction. And all of a sudden, we may find ourselves with two different things: an economy that's multi-actor and multi-system, and a political system and a single party with a particular speech that doesn't jive with reality. And that's what we need to avoid. This is what it's all about. Avoiding it when every sector, the private, the public, and the cooperative sectors all embrace the socialist model. From there, it's not that the capitalist or the small businessman doesn't want to make money, but it's you make money in the context of a society that has other goals and you contribute to them. So no more. Let me ask you, what do you want to, what can we can talk about? What do you want to talk about?
Sounds great to me.
Say more. How does it work?
Okay, well, yeah.
How do you prevent that when expanding the private, that it
Okay, one way is a
creates
whole
more
concept.
inequality,
Right.
the
Well,
factor which goes against the ideas of
yes, it does. I mean, the inequality is inevitable because you are opening up the society, and those who have the ability and the capital and the capacity to rise above the basic, the rest of society in terms of the private businesses are going to do better, and they're going to make more money. There's cap, there are all kinds of limits that are imposed. For example, you can only be a partner in one small enterprises. You can't be in more than one. The small enterprises can only have small, medium, and micro, small, and medium. The medium, which is the largest one, can have a maximum of 100 occupants, which is between the sum of employees and partners. So that's as much as you can grow. You can grow to 100 and no more. You can only be partnering one. So you can't have a whole bunch of businesses. And there's limits that the government hopes and expects will put limits. It's very difficult because what happens when you have all this excess capital? What are you going to do? And some people are doing horrible things, like they have a very successful restaurant in Cuba, in Habana, and then since they can't open up a second restaurant, they open it up in Cancun.
Yes.
Well, shit, that doesn't help us, But they're taking away the capital that was earned in Cuba because they are limited in their expansion. Those things we're going to need to work. But there are some institutional limits. But the reality is that it has to be something that Cubans, private, cooperative, and public sector all take as part of their philosophy and part of their business model. And it begins with a Cuban version of business social responsibility. Now, when you say that, you think of Coca-Cola doing all kinds of good things while they monopolize all the water in the world, and Texaco saying, no, this is why they contaminate the Ecuadorian rainforest. But the reality is that we have a different view of social responsibility. That means taking responsibility, first of all, for your business and for your employees and their families. And then beyond that, with the community, your clients, your customers, your suppliers, and in general, the society. And here is the need for the local governments to play a coordinating role. For the local governments, for the first time, to take into account that there are more than just state enterprises in their economic environment. Because before, or until now, they practically ignore everybody else. So you have private workers, you have cooperatives, and they're not even taken into account in the local government planning and development planning and everything else, because for them it's only state. Well, let's change. And so we need to move in that direction of trying to be more inclusive in terms of planning and then reducing the load of social programs for the central government by taking some of that load into the enterprises themselves, whatever their form of property or management. So that's one way. So,
Question?
yes.
So, are there any other socialist or quasi-socialist countries that approach this model or have features of it, or not?
Not really.
Okay.
I think Venezuela has made an effort, and they have done a lot of things in terms of decentralizing power to the communities and everything else. But it's very hard for them because they are under even more strain because they have a diverse society still with a lot of opposition inside and so on. I was invited. This is an incredible thing. I went to Asia for the first time for this conference in Manila. And the second time, I didn't ever expect to go to Asia. I was invited by the mayor, by the city council of Seoul, South Korea, who are extremely active in social solidarity economy.
Really?
They have an incredible number of cooperatives, and they are really championing this. So they did a conference about socialist solidarity economy in ex-socialist countries. I said, hey, we're not ex. And so they invited a person from a researcher on agricultural researcher from China, a woman from Croatia who is now a professor, a very respectful professor at St. Mary's University in Canada, in Nova Scotia. She is a specialist in cooperatives, and they invited me from Cuba. So I went to Saul. It was, hey, I could talk all night about it. It was an incredible experience. The first time I bought a face mask. Everybody was wearing a face mask when they had colds. I was like, this is great.
Yeah.
Let me buy a set of 10 face masks. And all of a sudden I came here, and wow, the COVID breaks out, and here I have my 10 face masks that I brought from Korea. And you know what they wanted? They wanted to explore how social and solidarity economy could help bridge the economies of North and South Korea when the unification came about. It was wonderful. I said, wow. It's a horribly, I think it's a task that can't be done because North Korea ain't nothing you can do about it. But it was just an incredible experience and an effort. So I said to the organizer, well, who are the people from North Korea? Well, this one on the panel, she's a defector from North Korea. She was on the panel. She was good. She was really good. I said, but we didn't invite anybody else, but we know the North Koreans know exactly what we're doing here. You know, they're keeping tabs on this conference. And we know it because when things like this happen, they either come out against it or they don't say anything. So if they don't say anything, they're looking, with interest at what we're doing. So the answer is no. Nobody's doing it, at least in this way. And I think that this is one of the things that Cuba is actually working towards the possibility of a true self-sufficient and sustainable socialism in the 21st century that has that recognizes the need for a market, the need for different forms of property, and different forms of management, because a lot of what we call private property in Cuba is actual private management of state property, exactly, particularly state land. So agriculture, a lot of agricultural workers are private workers, but they have a plot of land, and the government, it's in usufruct. I don't know, the usage of this land without paying rent, with a 25-year lease and the capacity to pass it on to their offspring, etc. But they don't own it. The ownership of the means of production are in the state. And that's happening in a lot of different areas now, more and more. For example, you can do a restaurant in a building across the street that belongs to the municipality of Habana, and they either rent you or let you use the space, particularly in exchange for fixing it up and stuff like that. They use it up for 3 years before paying rent. So this concept of private business, private and cooperative doesn't necessarily imply that the land and other means of production are converted, are privatized. So it's incorrect to say that there is a process of privatization. That's not right. There is a process of opening the economy to the existence of small, medium-sized enterprises and cooperatives. So this is one of the great things. When we look at the Cuban economy from the half empty bottle, things are dire. I mean, there's shortages of everything. People are struggling to live. They're struggling to feed themselves. They're struggling to move about, public transportation and everything else. And, you had the 11 July social explosion, or what do you want to call it. And so everybody, a bunch of people, that would like this place to sink, are saying that's the sign that the revolution is going down. So, and a lot of people in Cuba also would agree. And a lot of young people are ready to leave as quickly as they can, as they are in Mexico, in Colombia, in Central America, in Africa. So the whole movement of moving to a richer country is not unique to Cuba. So But if you look at it from the bottle half full, what do we see? First of all, after a 13, almost 14% drop in GDP in 1920, particularly in 20, we have three quarters, and this is the fourth of growth. So small, 2% average for last year. But what you're seeing is, in economic terms, the end of the recession. 4 quarters of continual growth. Well, we still need a couple of years just to get back to what we were in 2019, but there's growth. There is this whole opening to the state, to the private and cooperative sector, which they've been saying for two Communist Party Congresses for 10 years without doing it. And they're finally, starting in August, doing it. And today, or yesterday, there were almost 2,000 small and medium-sized enterprises, cooperatives, that were already approved, including about 200, or I don't know how they do more than that are state-owned. So here's an interesting thing. A small enterprise doesn't necessarily have to be private. So for example, the University of Pinar del Rio, which is a vanguard university right now, they are out there. They created a medium-sized enterprise owned by the university, and it's called Consultores UPR, University of Pinar del Rio. And they are consultants, they are professors, they have created a medium-sized enterprise to provide consulting services by professors, and that means professors earn more. And a lot of enterprises in Cuba and in other places are already receiving consulting services. So the interesting thing is that not only the private sector can open a medium-sized enterprise. So that's one. And then the other thing is that these small units are now capable of importing and exporting. They define their own prices. They create their own markets. They can buy and sell, and they're getting more options as well to the state enterprise, more autonomy, more capacity to decide on production, prices, markets, imports and exports. So those are the good things. The bad things is that we're in the middle of the perfect storm. We have no money. We have very few exports. Our exports of professional services, particularly health services, were squashed by governments like Brazil and Bolivia with the coup d'etat, by the U.S. government pressuring everybody and their mother for not bringing any Cuban doctors and whatever help. And that was the first source of income for Cuba, the export of professional services. The second was tourism, and I don't have to tell you what happened with tourism. The third one was remittances. Yeah. So when they screwed up the first two, then they went after the third. And so the remittances are severely limited. Western Union was closed, so there's no legal way to bring dollars. And the government of Cuba didn't help too much because now you can't deposit dollars in the banks. You got to deposit euros or Canadian dollars and so on. And so we have a huge, huge crunch in terms of foreign income. And that affects everything. But it's a country that depends on imports, everything from food to fertilizer, to seeds, to raw materials, everything, machinery, parts, the whole production of the incredible production of the COVID vaccines was done with all the opposition from the U.S., the blockage of the capacity to purchase imports, equipment, parts all over the world. Purchases that were already agreed on were not realized because the company said, well, we don't want to violate the U.S. embargo, so we can't supply you. And so we are in a very difficult foreign income constraints, and that really limits the growth capacity and the capacity for people to satisfy their needs. And so it's a very difficult moment.
Yes, somebody. I'm not an economist, but Someone talked about the Mondragon cooperatives, and like in depressed areas of Cleveland, Ohio, where it's plants have closed, they're trying the Mondragon model of cooperatives. Is that what you're talking about? And would this be for like, energy or small goods, or what is it that you're
Okay,
going to
so
make?
cooperatives in Cuba were first of all agricultural. So there are 3 types of agricultural cooperatives, but for many years that was the only cooperative that was allowed. Thank you so much. And different variants. I don't want to get into the details, but basically for agricultural production. And then in 2010, for the first time, non-agricultural cooperatives were allowed. And these are workers' cooperatives in industry and services. Of those cooperatives that were about 400, almost 500 that were approved, not all were operative, but or became operative. But of those, the 70% were state enterprises that were turned over to the workers. You think they turned over the profitable ones, the one that was doing really great? Hell no. They turned over the restaurants that were losing money, the shops that were losing money, and the other was that they couldn't build, fix the roof, and they turned over their refuse and expected cooperativism of the workers who had never been cooperatives or asked to be cooperative in their lives, and all of a sudden they become associates of a cooperative. They had no idea what they were doing. They were employees, state employees, and state doesn't matter. They were employees of a company, of a corporation, and all of a sudden you're told to run your own thing, and if you don't make a profit, you're out. And so surprising number of cooperatives survived, with all those handicaps. And then about 30%, a little less, were bottom-up cooperatives. And so these cooperatives are very small compared to Mondragon. Mondragon is an industrial cooperative that began, in industrial production and so on. And they grew and they grew and they went overseas. And I have my doubts whether today it's actually a legitimate and not a false cooperative, but I think they've done wonderful things. And it's interesting because they were created by the Catholic Church in País Vasco, in the Basque Country. So it's this whole social movement of the Catholic Church that influenced the creation of it. But it's quite different in a way, the movement. In Cuba, it's a lot of much smaller cooperatives. There's today somewhere in close to 5,000 between the agricultural, which have been decreasing because of so many that have not been profitable, have not been able to pay for their way. And the business, the industry and service cooperatives, which are once again beginning to grow. They were basically stagnated, but with the new laws in August that take effect in September, not only have small businesses grown, but also cooperatives. Not at the same rate, but they have also.
Well, from what I've read, one issue seems to, with small businesses, seems to be getting people to pay taxes. Is that a correct perception?
The tax rate's high. It's high, for example, compared to the U.S. It's somewhere like the tax rates for Canada or for Scandinavian countries. And it jumps very quickly. It's very progressive. But there's different types of taxes. There's income tax, which is the one that's stiffer, and there's sales tax, which is flat rate, and there's different kinds of taxes. But mostly the tax is high, given two things. Number one, what are the public services I'm getting in exchange for? So you can go to Canada, you can go to your town meeting and say, hey, I pay taxes. Where's my roads and my whatever and my public transportation? In Cuba, it's very hard to match the taxes that you pay with the services that you receive. And number two is the fact that still there are many things that people have to do outside of the market, of the formal market system, inputs and so on, that means that you can't write them off as costs, which would lower your taxable income. So you can write off your costs. But for example, a automobile repair shop, if you can't buy the parts in the stores, you don't have the ticket. You can't justify what you bought. So you bought from people who either, ripped off a car and sold you the parts, or brought it from abroad and imported them in their suitcase or something. And so the auto parts store says, auto shop has a lot of difficulty in justifying their purchases of parts to the degree that the IRS, the equivalent, demands. And so they end up having this huge income, which they have to pay very high rates, up to 50% of profit, and then it becomes a burden. And so until now, what happened was a lot of tax evasion. So you have a cash economy that you don't have to pay taxes on. So then you go to a restaurant and they all get payment in cash, and then I'll report half of it, just like the mafia in the parking lots, kind of thing. But it was a survival for many stores. Now, with the new regulations, a lot of the business has to go through the bank, and they ain't no getting around that. When it goes through the bank, your income is registered, and so it is a problem. But there's a bigger problem, and you've heard of the monetary reordering or the unification of the currencies, and this took place last year. For many economists, it was the worst time, the worst moment of doing the unification. The last large unification of currency that was done in the world was done by the Germans, and it was done in 1990 or 1989 with the unification, or I should say the absorption, taking over East Germany by the West. What did the West do? They exchanged the Deutschmarks of East Germany 1-to-1 for Deutschmarks of West Germany. So all of a sudden, the East Germans had all this money that they could do all this purchasing, consuming, cars and TVs and everything else. They went wild. Of course, there was no opposition to the unification. They were bought off, literally bought off by West Germany. So if you got a lot of money, you can do the reunification, and you can fill in the gaps, and you can sustain. You can, you can protect yourself against inflationary forces, and you can do it to the satisfaction of the public. Well, Cuba did that without any reserves, without the possibility of going to the IMF or the World Bank or the IDB or anybody to give you basically a support for going through this very painful process of unifying the currency. And so we've all had to do it, biting the bone. And that means a significant inflation, calculated by the government about 70% last year, which is way under the real, because 70%, as they say, look, we haven't had inflation after the rates were increased, together with the salaries and the unification and so on. Electricity costs the same, or even less for the farmers and so on. Water costs the same. Communications has gone down. It costs less for mobile data and cell phone service than it did a year ago. Health is still free. Education is still free. So what do you talk about inflation? Well, the inflation is in the market, and it's for food, and it's for toiletries, and it's for building materials, everything that is just not available. So a sack of cement now costs a huge bundle of money, because there's no. Well, what do you do? How do you produce cement? With energy. You produce the cement, and so you've had all these limitations in terms of importing fuel, which costs more and more, and so you have, the cement plants are not working at the same capacity, and you can do that you can say about everything else: soap, detergent, toilet paper, everything, food. And so, but the measures to strengthen strengthen the autonomy of the farmer, of the agricultural sector, is already producing. It's already producing results in terms of higher production of foods, of some foods. Some, for example, we eat a lot of pork. You know that. Pork is we call it the national animal. It shouldn't be that beautiful three-colored bird, the topororo. It should be the pig, you know, because it's. But what happens? What do you feed the pigs? You feed them. Feed, and the feed is cereal. The majority is corn. So we don't produce enough corn to satisfy the demand for the pigs. So the whole thing is feed them, you know, homegrown feeds, different kinds of the yuca, kinds of things. But that is the pig production has gone way down, and so the cost of pork has become prohibitive. And a lot of Cubans basically ate pork, and now they basically eat chicken because we import the chicken from the United States. And the state provides chicken at a flat rate, no inflation on the chicken, but I'm going to grow feathers any moment now, you know? There's so much chicken. But the thing is that those are things that people suffer every day. They suffer through every day, and they get really pissed at having to stay in line for 2 hours or 3 hours to buy a thing of chicken and some detergent and this and that, because you still don't satisfy the basic needs. And even though there is the rationing system and you get rice and beans and sugar, but it only is sufficient for, say, 2 weeks of the month. The rest of the month you have to make do, buy things in the market, and surviving the best way you can. Let me start with the beginning. The first thing is that the public, represented by the state, owns all natural resources in Cuba. Everything below the ground, above the ground, and in the air. Now, above the ground, that does not include private homes, it does not include private land, plots of land where you have your home. That doesn't include private farms, and there's still a lot of private farms. But in general, it does include mining, it does include forests, unless you have a forestry farm. I mean, there are people whose farm is grow, wood for forestry products. But in general, that's a very important thing, because there is no way that you can own a mine in Cuba. There's no way you can own a beach in Cuba. There's no way that you can exploit that from the point of view of the private sector. That doesn't mean that there are concessions for private or cooperative use of resources in terms of, production and so on, and sale, which is the other part I was telling, the difference between ownership and management. And I think that what we're talking about here is that Cuba is really not rich in natural resources. It's not rich in water resources. It doesn't have a lot of minerals. Well, it has the nickel. They just found gold somewhere, but it's not really. We produce enough crude oil for about most of our electricity needs. But that's a very heavy oil, like the Campeche oil in the Gulf of Mexico, and so it requires getting rid of all the sulfur, which a lot of it, is in danger, not always, but of going into the atmosphere, et cetera, et cetera. But about 50% of the oil needs, which is for the production of electricity, and generally, and some in industries, but most electricity is produced in Cuba. A lot of it with foreign capital, in partnership with foreign capital, Canadian, Chinese, Spanish, and the rest of it we have to import. All fuel for transportation, for industry, has to be imported. So we have limited natural resources. And I think that one of the things where the potential, in terms of particularly the solidarity, social solidarity economy, the potential is in recyclables, in reuse, in recovery of raw materials, whatever waste, solid waste, and recycling of solid waste, even liquid waste in terms of usage for green areas. For a lot of hotels today, process the gray waters and they use them for their gardens, their green areas, which is very good because Cuba has a shortage of water. So if you're going to have hotels that use a whole lot of water, and you can recover part of it and use it for outdoors. And so I think that that's where the potential is, particularly for the social and solidarity economy, how we can make use. And if you go to anybody that makes art in Cuba today, almost all art in Cuba is done with recyclable products. Incredible. Reusing all kinds of stuff. And so you're making art with shit, with stuff, with paper, with cardboard, with cans, with things like that. And that's just the way, in some way, that's the way the Cuban economy, not all of it, but a lot of it is functioning in automobiles. How do you keep our cars running? The old American cars, and even have a Chinese car, 15 years old, and you still have to find ways to build parts and recycle parts and use a Russian part on a Chinese car, or use it on a Ford or a Chevy. So that would be the way I would say that there's a connection. And in terms of bureaucracy is still with us. It's alive and well. It's a way of managing scarce resources sometimes, and people that have a little bit of power, and they have a responsibility. How do you manage a whole line of people going out to buy chicken, without upheaval, without people fighting each other and beating each other up? Well, you put a little paper with a number on it, and you get number 42 and you're number 47 and so on in line, and then there's the people who put, who stick in other numbers so you can go first, and there's the woman who's at the door and she lets her family go in unnoticed, and that's why it's 10 minutes when it should be 2. All these things happen because scarcity breeds corruption at all levels. I remember when I saw, in the special period, the so-called special period, I saw The Bicycle Thief, the Italian film, realism, neo-realism. And it was in Sicily or southern Italy after the war, and it was this thing, people were stealing bicycles and women were prostituting themselves for nylons and stuff like that. Well, that's what happens when you're poor. That's what happens when you're desperate. You become a prostitute, or you steal the bicycle, or you do anything to survive. And that's the lesson, is that when you get out of this situation, then you can have fashion, Italian fashion, and Italian this and Italian that. But they were eating rats, 50 years ago or 60 or 70 years. And when we are facing some of these problems, I say, well, we are surviving. And people are surviving in different ways. And if you don't have a light bulb at home and can't buy it in the store, you wait till everybody goes and they steal that light bulb. But I don't have a light bulb at home. And now instead of 3, there's only 2. Because I can't buy it. It's not in the stores. And if it was in hard currency and I can't pay for it. And then they get used to it. Oh, whenever I can, I'll steal it. Because I'm stealing from the government. I'm stealing from the state. That doesn't count. That's not morally reprehensible. I can still tell my kids to be honest and everything, and come back with a light bulb, or come back with something I stole from my workplace, and that's okay, because I didn't steal it from you or you. I stole it from the government or the state. hell, it's really difficult, to overcome all these things because they're bred by necessity, and they are nurtured by a system that is patronizing, and it's supposed to solve all your problems, and you're not supposed to be able to do it yourself. You have to wait for the state to unplug your toilet. You know what I mean? That isn't the way it is now. But for many years it was.
Kind of just along that. So I've heard a lot of this, right? But what's given me kind of hope within that context, because I know these people, is that they're pissed at like counter revolution. They're pissed that like they're not racist, they're not capitalist, they like want better socialism, which is like
great.
cool. It's like, okay, they're pissed,
Right.
but they wanted better socialism. I go, okay.
Oh, and they also want the good things of both systems. They sometimes they're not compatible. Like, I want socialism, but I want capitalist. I want to make a lot of money, or I want capitalism to thrive. And sometimes you gotta, there's a payoff.
Yeah, I was just curious, going back to what you talked about at the beginning about this like decentralization to the local level. And you mentioned health and education, but it sounds like you were saying not those things to be decentralized. But
Right.
So what kinds of services exactly are you talking about going to?
Well, there's a concept in economics of which I forget the word, of course. It's not devolution, but it's providing the services as close as possible to those that are going to receive them. Okay, remember the term. But there are things in Cuba that really are centrally planned and delivered. They're not delivered centrally because health is delivered by the people in that hospital or in that clinic, etc. But health is national system. Education is a national system. There are allowances for local experiences and a lot of the management is done by the municipality. So you give the money to the municipality to run their schools and to run their hospitals and to run their family clinics, etc., etc. And that's okay because it's a system that works, that provides quality services at really all levels and quality education. Not all schools are the same or have the same quality education. It has a lot to do, like in the U.S., with the neighborhoods. The neighborhoods, but it's not because of the budget or the books. It's because the social environment in which you're doing educating, the situation of the families, the number of children that are, with single mothers, the number of kids that are in sub-quality housing, the violence in the community, in the neighborhood. And so all these things have an impact on the school and on the education. But we don't have black neighborhoods and white neighborhoods and rich neighborhoods and poor neighborhoods. In general, that's not the way it is. I mean, there are some neighborhoods that are without whatever is better off, better housing, and so on, more services than, say, further south. We call it the Habana Deep South. There's 50 municipalities. There's 5 on the coast, which are relatively better off, and the 10 below it. But it's a relative thing. I mean, it's not, what you see in the States in terms of the vast differences between one part of the city and another. But the services that can be devolved have a lot to do, the devolution of services or have a lot to do with those things that can be provided better at the local level. And, it has to do with things like, water, sewage, electricity is generally centralized. There's a central system, but has also local. But many things like the management of these things often goes to the municipal government. So now the municipal government is burdened with making sure that their daycare center has, the plumbing is working, because when it doesn't, work, then you got to send the kids home, and then the whole thing explodes. The mothers can't work, blah 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 blah. But it also have to make sure that there's bread, that the bread production, so that everybody gets their bun, one per person per day. And so the local government, instead of governing, is trying to make sure that there's bread, that the schools are working, that the daycare centers are working, these are things that burden the small tasks that burden the local government. So when you ask them to do planning, to do development planning, to look further, to look toward how to raise income in order to fund different types of projects to grow and to expand, they very often they are unable to respond. And another reason is that for years and years, working in the local government was not a very interesting or well-paying job. So it attracted not the brightest, not the best professionals or technicians or workers in the community. So you don't have today the human capacity to take on the tasks that the new process of decentralization is giving them. And that's a very difficult thing because you're asking them to do things that they're not ready to do. Write a project. We all think that that's something, we've all written projects, we've got money, we do this, we get that. Write a project? Hey, that is a real difficult thing if you've never done it before. It's a real difficult thing to put your objectives, to turn your problem into objectives, the objectives into tasks, the tasks into a budget, the budget into how you're going to raise the money. I mean, it sounds simple, but it's a really difficult task. So you're giving that to a person who comes from education or sports or whatever, and is now a functionary in a local government. And you tell them, to raise money. You want money? Yeah, we got money, but you got to write a project. And the bank has to approve it. The bank doesn't work like a socialist, the bank works like any bank in the world. You give me liability, but something that backs up your loan, and you show me that you're going to get the money back in the period that you said. Give me a true business plan. Give me a feasibility study. What? What's that? And then you're asking these people to do all this shit. That's what we say. The universities, the research institutes, we have to go along with them. We have to accompany, we have to coach, we have to help. I am writing 3 projects right now for 3 different municipalities. And one of them, I don't need to. They're gung-ho, they're great. The other 2 are illiterates in this area. And I gotta help them. I gotta write the project. It's for them to present and evaluate and so on and so forth. And this is what's happening all over the Cuba right now. Is that there's not a match between the devolution of responsibilities and resources. That's not just responsibility given to the municipalities and their capacity to carry them through.
It seems like maybe covered this in some sense. There's a real strain in terms of the lack of food sovereignty. I know there's
Yes.
an international context let's assume that won't change. What can the state do, whether it's decentralization or not, to create more food sovereignty? Farming practices, trying things they maybe used to do in special period or before, or something new, something. I mean, I know, I'm not trying to compare the two, but Nicaragua is fairly food sovereign.
Yes.
Can't be strangled very much.
Yes. That's a very interesting comparison.
And what can Cuba
Okay, so we begin by historical analysis, which is that Cuba is a plantation economy from colonial days. So we produced a few crops and imported everything else. Sugar, tobacco, cattle, then nickel, and so on, tobacco, coffee, etc. And that's the economy that was set up by the Spaniards and nurtured by the Americans, and then by the Russians, by the way, or by the Soviets. And so we have that historical burden. But then comes the part of the state wanting to centralize agricultural production and food distribution and food processing, and everything was in the hands of the state. And at one point it became obvious that the state could not. And you're talking about decentralization. A lot of decentralization now is being done in agriculture and food production. We import 80% of the food we consume. It's embarrassing. But hey, where's Puerto Rico? What about Jamaica? Have you looked at the islands of the Caribbean? I mean, they're either like us or worse. And so what we have is a situation that's inherent to our historical system and to the island, to the condition of an island that has limited. We love bread and we don't produce wheat or can produce wheat because we love bread because, we're a Spanish culture. We should be eating yuca, cassave or something, which is what was eaten here before they arrived. And so the reality is that we have this legacy, both of our needs, our use, our desires for food, as well as the fact that we inherited the system and then we got it worse with the state intervening in every process. Nicaragua has a totally small scale family agriculture. Despite all their problems, they're almost totally self-sufficient in food. It's amazing. But we have a lot of state farms still, not many, because many of them have been broken up into smaller farms, but in certain crops, particularly export crops still, like sugar or tobacco still, it's grown at a very small scale, but there's a monopsony. The state buys all the tobacco leaves and produces the cigars, even in decentralized shops, but then the sale, the export is completely in state hands, which is not bad. It works out well. They get the growers get good money, and the rollers get good money, and the Chinese smoke a lot of cigars. So the problem is, and then what's happened? What's happened is in the last year or two, the government has finally realized the need to foster small family farms and to grant the farmers, including the farm cooperatives, the necessary autonomy. What does that mean? That means they now decide practically on their own what to grow, when to grow it, what prices they're going to sell it at, to whom, to what markets they're going to sell it. And there's 63 measures. That's 63 measures for the Cuban agricultural sector, which are already, despite the conservative nature of farmers and the fact that they say, yeah, you're going to tell me to open up now, but then next year you're going to close again and you're going to squeeze me in the vice. What do you call it? Vice?
Vice.
Because we've done that a bunch of times. We open up and then we close, and everybody in the middle gets squeezed. You know what I mean? So they don't trust the government, particularly farmers. Farmers are very conservative people. But it's beginning to work. They're producing more. They're marketing more. They have more options of who to sell to. But you still have a great demand by the social sector. In other words, the state still has to buy for all the schools, for all the hospitals, for all the nursing homes, for all the people who have special diets. And beginning with children, which still receive a liter of milk per day until they're 7 years old, how much milk does that you require? And therefore, dairy farmers have to sell part of their production to the state, sometimes all of it. Before it was all of it. Now it's most of it. And other farmers have to sell. You sign a contract. And that contract has what is called, it's like your social commitment, or your social obligation, which means part of your crop is contracted to the state so that the state can use it for, social services and social use of food. And before that was done at a very low prices, so the incentive for the farmer was to hide the food, to report low production and sell it on the side. And now what they've done is what they had to do all the time, which is raise prices of what they buy from the farmers, even though that food is subsidized, or it's given away for free to the students or to the patients, or it's highly subsidized for all of us who receive food from the rationing system. We pay a lot less for our beans and rice and sugar and this and that of the real cost. And there's less of a subsidy, but there's still a subsidy. And then there's an extra subsidy for the family that that is in poverty, or the older persons whose pension doesn't go far enough. So there's an extra subsidy. So there's always a way. There's always a requirement where the state has to foot the bill. And so the farmer is in the middle because they want to produce, they need money, they need inputs. The state doesn't always sell them the input, the fuel, the fertilizers, the seed. They don't always collect the harvest in time, and then the tomatoes rot, and they're there, and you have a contract with a state company to pick them up, and they don't show up, and then it rots, and then who pays for the tomatoes? The system of, I'm going to take you to court, and you're going to pay me for my rotting tomatoes, still doesn't work out. It's beginning. But those are the things that are a lot of state enterprises are late in their payment to the farmers for the produce that they purchase. And so the farmer squeezed, has a liquidity shortage or crunch because they're not getting paid. But who hasn't paid them? Not the market over here that's selling their produce. No, it's the whatever company in the agricultural system bought it and hasn't paid them. But then that company's selling to the health department, to the health ministry. The health ministry hasn't paid them because the money to pay them is the one that they used to earn when the doctors and the nurses and so went abroad. So now they don't have the income from that, so they can't pay the agricultural company, so the agricultural company can't pay the farmer, so the farmers say, fuck it, next year I'm not growing any tomatoes. And it's a vicious circle that has to do with a flawed system, but it also has to do with the whole effects of scarcity and shortages. And that's not the excuse, because we could be like Nicaragua. It's a shame we're not like Nicaragua. But that means a lot more private sector activity in agriculture and everything, in the whole productive chain, from production to commercialization to everything. And they do that. They can import. They don't have a blockade. They can import, a fertilizer and seed and everything else from the U.S. or whatever. They don't have, the same limitations, but they just bet on private, small-scale farming, and it went well for them. It is going well for them. And we bet on state production and big farms and all this, and it went well.
So I've been listening for a while and kind of going, where are we? And because
Are we?
yeah,
Okay.
no, because what you're doing, what I've heard is a lot of descriptive about what's going on in Cuba, what's kind of day-to-day things like you were just talking about. And I don't quite get what, where is this going? Because you started out talking about a solidarity, socialism, and I don't get a sense of what that means. And, because what I'm hearing is what I've heard lots of when people talk about Cuba and its problems, but I don't really get a sense of anything different.
Well,
I hear little pieces of, you know, we could do this or we could do that, but I'm not quite. I kind of am like
the big picture.
the big picture, but also kind of like, you know, there's a blockade, there's a lot of issues that are impacting all this, and so what happens? I mean, this seems to me like it's just more description about the economy.
I think that what we need here is to see this as an experiment in constructing a new form of socialism, a new order
Yeah.
that is not the old centralized planning, the centralized decision making, and it has to do with, and not a system in which the state production of goods and services is practically dominant in every aspect of society. But now it's a mixed system of private, cooperative, and state. And now the interactions between all these players must be, it's like they don't have any grease. You know, you need to bring them together. How you buy from this and you sell to that. And this is the distribution sphere. But in the production sphere, you have a lot more incentive now for people to produce, both at the private level, but also state enterprises and cooperatives, but agricultural production. So the model is really less decentralized. Let's give more power to the people at the lower level. Let's give more opportunity for people to make a living with different ways. Either working for the state or working for themselves or working and forming a cooperative. And let's try to make socialism work. Let's try to make all this work in such a way that it doesn't just go into a different form of capitalism, like the Eastern country, or like you could say, in a way, it's China and Vietnam, which is basically a lot of capitalism squeezed into a one-party state, right? And so, how can we do better? And nobody has done it. I mean, we're experimenting every day in trying to generate a system that will keep people in, beginning with the young people. Make them want to stay in Cuba. How many young people don't want to stay in Cuba, don't want to live here, they don't see their future in this one. So very difficult because people want, you know, short-term solutions and they want to be able to buy a car and have a house and things that seem normal. They were normal in the States some years ago, and now you find it. The kids, you know, coming out of college, going to their parents' home or riding the bus. You know, things can get screwed along the way. And I think the big picture is, look, we are trying to do something different, and we refuse to accept that the only solution is just turning everything over to capitalism and to the, you know, and to the multi-party system of electoral and campaigns and shit like that. So. If we are basically, we don't want to play by those rules, but we have to make our own rules. Nobody has done it. You know, nobody has them. Nobody has them today in the so-called socialist countries, much less in the countries that moved from, you know, capitalism, so socialism to capitalism in Eastern Europe. And so it's a huge challenge. I think that's part of the problem that the thinkers in the U.S. that really view Cuba as a potential challenge in terms of the model that could be applicable to the rest of the third world are totally right. If this thing survives, if it doesn't collapse, everybody's going to live to say, look, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, these people were really having a hard time, and now they've gotten their shit together and they're producing and they're, you know, and they're happy and whatever, and they don't have violence on the streets and there's no drugs and so on and so forth. And so it's an alternative model. And I still believe that we can do that. It's a huge, huge challenge. And it's particularly huge for the generations that don't have the commitment that I have, that we have.
Yeah, this is a great talk, and I think your question is right on. Like, wow, is there hope? You know, where's all this going? One thing I think Cuba has going for it is what seems to be like the low price of land, or the concept that you keep land, you keep buildings accessible to the people.
Yeah.
Because then, and you've probably heard of the Grameen Bank.
The
The Grameen Bank, the
Okay.
Indian model of micro loans.
yes.
So, when you were talking about people not knowing how to do projects, you were talking municipal, that's pretty macro, even, micro macro, right? What people are needing, or, what I, first, just an example. Someone I know has an idea, young man, and he wants to start a beauty salon. I'm
Yeah.
like, you're pretty good looking, but what? He's like, no. He says, I do tattoos.
Okay.
He's a super artist. He says, not bad ones, socially correct, all, cool, artistic, gorgeous things, which the youth want. He says, with a small seed, and it could be a grant or a micro loan, I can rent a place because I know someone who does nails and someone else who does
Sure.
hair. And so you have a cooperative of a beauty, and you've taken care of now 4 or 5 families who have the little mini.
Yeah.
And then you've created like a little economic hub that kind of makes people happy,
Right.
But they need that little bit of seed money.
Okay. Well, a lot of the seed money today is being provided by remittances.
KY.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, but now here's the inherent inequality in it.
Okay.
Remittances are by people who went abroad,
Yeah.
who are primarily urban, white, middle class,
Yeah.
and so you
Start that
get
business.
so you want to start that business. It's much more probable than they have family abroad
Yeah.
if they're white, if they're from Havana, if they're from middle class,
But-
than if they are poor
So
from
why can't
Guantanamo.
the state see that as a legitimate?
Well, it is, and they're
$1,000.
but they're not. It is, and they're beginning to provide microloans. The banks are beginning to, but they're not starting with nails or
Yeah, just
tattoos.
an example.
They're starting with productive
Yeah.
enterprises, and that's very important to differentiate. He says, I want to, create a small industry for processing tomatoes, and I'm growing tomatoes in the backyard, or I'm buying tomatoes from my neighbors who have family farms, and I'm going to make a small cottage industry of processed foods. There they'll get their loan, the micro loan. But to make a tattoo parlor, you ain't going to get it. At least not now. I mean, there's not enough money for that, and it's not considered, social value. I mean, it is important. Not to tell you that there's anything bad about beauty parlors or the state doesn't make a value judgment. It just says if we got a shortage of funds, we're going to start with those that produce value, and not services, that have to do with
But
people's.
they have an interest in those micro.
But it's beginning now. It's new because it requires a different type of banking. So in fact, there's a new banking structure for these types of loans. But it's going to take a couple of years. I mean, this whole thing that you're seeing now, this revolution almost in in the private sector and small and medium-sized enterprises, it's a real revolution. It's no shit. It's real, and it's happening. But it requires a lot of,
And I'm just gonna say what you as you know, there's a huge movement in the United States for those cottage,
Right.
land-based kind of industries.
Well,
We
for
have a large
sure.
solidarity.
Now I just
People
and
never
you
make
see
that
every day.
money.
I go to places and I see. It's incredible to see the shop. I went to a place yesterday. It's called Bodegon 21. It's on 21st Street, very near here, and they have a store, and it's expensive. It's like a small sort of food boutique, but they have all these vegetables clear in bags, of plastic bags, with all kinds of vegetables that are relatively exotic for Cuba. Not completely, but they're difficult. Like rucola or arugula in Spanish. Arugula is in English, rucola in Spanish, and different types of lettuce and different types of this. And I said, wow. And then they have croquetas and they have sausages, and they're all made here. Oh, they also have imported olive oil and the best Habana Club rum and shit like that. But they have a beautiful rum called, it's a brand name called Pasillero. Pasillo is with an S is a hall, and Pasillo with a Z, with a Z, is the name of this this bar that opened up, which is a great place for, we call chupitos. Chupitos are shots. But this guy is buying rum from the state, wholesale, and it's doing exotic rums. So there was shrimp rum, there was this rum, and it's wonderful. And he already registered the name, the brand name, and has the design, the very modern but very chic, like not at all excessive, whatever design, and they're selling and they're exporting. And this is a young engineer from Camagüey who came to Havana and opened a bar and is now exporting specialty rums. That's the revolution I'm talking about. It's really incredible. So this store had the Havana Club, but it also had the Pasillero rums. I was actually, had the notion that I wanted to buy it, but I'll still stick to Havana Club. But the point is that I think that what we're seeing is a whole different movement that we are not going to really see the results for the next 2 or 3 years, but it's going to be amazing. And then that's when the keeping everybody within the model, within the hopes, within the value system of socialism, that's when it becomes a challenge. Because when that young man earns a lot of money in his bar and in his rum business, is he going to, want
No,
to?
he's not.
But maybe he will. Maybe, he's already working with the government has, first of all, identified 62 neighborhoods in Havana that needed special. They're called people in vulnerable situations, which is the social scientists said it's not vulnerable people, it's people in vulnerable situations. Is a good. These are the people around me, the social scientists. So they identified these neighborhoods in vulnerable situations, and they're getting in there. They're doing things, and they're doing it with state money and state enterprise, but also the local government is pitching in, and the neighbors are pitching in, and they're fixing roads, and they're fixing the parks and the clinic. Oh, wonderful.
He's an entrepreneur.
It's more
That's
reggaeton.
Cuba, yeah. And I have a real hard time doing this. Well, I mean, dealing with it. But anyway, yeah.
It seems like, obviously we're leaving on, discussing the challenges of this project. It seems like I can never stop looking at it in the political context of the blockade.
Yes.
And it seems like it's not just unfair, but hard to judge it without constantly looking at that context. And maybe that context won't go away anytime soon.
No.
But are regular Cubans getting weary of or less conscious that that's a factor, and
It's like wolf.
and more
Crying
blaming
wolf.
to the government than
Yeah,
that
particularly
context?
young
Where is that
people say,
heading?
"Don't talk to me about the blockade anymore. Don't give me that rap anymore about the blockade," because it comes a point where you naturalize it and you don't think it really exists, and so is the propaganda from Miami and everything else. The problems are inherent in the system and the leadership, and not in there's no such thing as an embargo, and all these lies. But the question is that, yes, people are weary, and people are tired of the blockade being used as an excuse for mismanagement or for lack of policy to go beyond this. But this is changing, and one of the things that is changing is, let's not talk about the blockade anymore. Let's talk about, it's like, cold weather in Minnesota. You can't, you can't do anything about it. You just got to work with cold weather in Minnesota X number of months a year. So we got to live in a blockade 12 months a year. That's it. We have no choice. How do we do, how do we live, and how do we work, and how do we develop, and how do we progress with the blockade? Because it ain't going away soon. We had this hope with Obama, which was dashed by Trump and by Trump too.
It's frustrating to see this. Well, this is proof that there's this old quote by Elliot Abrams. We've been showing all over the world that socialism doesn't exist, and we can't let Cuba be an exception.
Right.
So they're really trying to make it not work.
That's right.
And
there are also people telling them they're about to collapse. They're just there. Push a little more. These fuckers are going to go down. Just push a little more, you know. And they're, Bob Menendez and Marco Rubio and the Cuban and in the U.S. right, the American right wing is saying, to the Democrats, push a little more. They're about to collapse. The Cubans are rising up all over the country, and they're going to bring down their government. And so there are a lot of people in the U.S. that believe that it's a matter of pushing it a little bit more. And so also there are people who are making a lot of money from maintaining the embargo. So it comes to
here? What's keeping that from happening here?
From what, collapsing?
Yeah.
Well, I think the will of the unity of the government. It's really true. The unity of government and people. I mean, there's a lot of people who are opposed, but this unity works. People still see the government as representing them. And there's one party, and they may be squabbling inside, but you generally don't learn about it. But in the end, there's a unified leadership. There is a model that's being put forward. And there's a sense that there is a response, that the government is responding finally, because for many years, it was like, well, where are the reforms that you've been mouthing for 10 years? Where are they? Why don't you establish them? So, I think that has a lot to do with it. And the fact is that, the Cubans are very resilient. They do with little things, and we go. I think a lot of people also think that what is our choice? Are we going to be Switzerland or are we going to be Dominican Republic? Hey, come on. We're not going to go to, Switzerland, capitalism or Sweden or Denmark. We're going to go to Honduras. We're going to go to Nicaragua. We're going to go down to a socialism that's going to leave out vast numbers of people in the country to fend for themselves, and to if you're worried about immigration crisis under socialism, wait till we have cutthroat capitalism. Oh, the country's going to empty out and go on rafts to the States, like the Haitians. And so what happens is that I think that a lot of people still have hopes and faith and are resistant to change. I mean, somebody may come and say, okay, so embrace capitalism or embrace, but what are the choices? A U.S. invasion? I mean, would you be amenable to an invasion from Wisconsin? Because, your economy is all screwed up? You don't want an invasion from Wisconsin.
Why not?
So what I'm saying is that it's just, where are the choices? You can't just jump to a society of plenty because you change a government or because you let the other government in make the decision for you. It doesn't happen.
So the other thing is, I don't think people realize, the level of collapse within the U.S. The level of collapse within the U.S.
They're not.
And
but that's the beauty of capitalism and individuality. You always have the hope that everybody else is going to be screwed, but you're going to make it. And the immigrant has that ingrained. The immigrant thinks that he or she will make it above the top.
But I think that's the old view, because in the U.S., I think there's a lot of support for socialism in the U.S. now. There's there's immigrants are not thinking they're going to make it, and I think there's the poverty rate is just going up and up and
Yeah.
up and up and more severe. So
But it's still, I think that in the mentality of
the
of
rich
people-
though are still doing really well.
Yeah, sure. But also, you have enough people who make it over, legally or illegally, and are able to satisfy immediate material needs, like, car or house or jewelry or whatever.
Immigrants? No.
Yeah, the Cubans that have gone over. Yeah,
Oh,
sure.
the Cubans.
The
yeah.
Cubans.
I was going to
And
say, but the other.
they say to
immigrants-
the family here, shit, I came over and now I'm driving a truck, and I'm a trucker, and I'm making a whole lot of money. Life of a trucker? I don't have to tell you what it means to be a trucker, But they're making a lot of money as a trucker. They already bought a house in Hialeah. They didn't buy it. They're paying the bank for the house they bought in Hialeah, for which the whole family's working, and if somebody loses a job, they lose the
They
mortgage.
collapse,
I mean,
yeah.
all those things we know, but when they talk to their cousin in Cuba, this is wonderful. The other day there was a domino game next to my house. Since we have these integrated neighborhoods in all kinds, we have a house next door to all these people, sort of massive people, and they don't have big living rooms or anything, so their social life is outside. So, and we all hear it because they speak very loud and everything. And we have this. Also, and my wife has very good hearing. I have horrible hearing. And she was saying, one of the players, domino players, is obviously visiting from abroad, the U.S. or something. And he said, Gregorio, don't you dare go to the States. You're not going to make it. You don't know how to work. You have no work ethic. You would never work like I do. He said, another one they call a nene. Nene is a huge black man, really, really friendly, really able, with a lot of abilities, but he barely works. So he said, Nene, don't you dare. You don't have no idea. You could not stand my work schedule. And so Nene is probably not interested in immigrating, but Nene's son may be, thinking, I'm going to work like, my uncle here, and I'm going to make a lot of money, and I'm going to come to Cuba with jewelry. I got to tell you, this place in Hialeah called Ño, que barato. Ño is like sort of a Cuban version of shit or something like that. Shit, how cheap. Que barato. So shit, how cheap is this warehouse in Hialeah, and it's an incredible thing. My son filmed it, made it part of his first full-length film, and it's a place that sells everything for Cuba, beginning with children's school uniforms, which sometimes you can't get, or you get maybe 3 shirts, 3, and 2 pants for the, and that's supposed to last you the school year, washing every day. And so they sell children's uniforms. They sell all the lycra, how do you say lycra? That all that Cuban women love, and the shirts with the U.S. flags that you see everywhere are insulting, but everybody. And so and they all sell it. Ño, que barato. Shit, how cheap it is. And there is an island there where they rent jewelry, gold jewelry. So you go there and you say, I'm going to Cuba next week, and I want to rent a watch, a chain, a bracelet, so that when I get to Cuba, I can show off how rich I am with my jewelry. And they don't own it; they rented it. And can you believe a culture in which you rent jewels so you can impress the people back home? It's the same in Dominican Republic, it's the same in Haiti, it's the same in Mexico, it's the same in all the Latin countries. It's not unique to Cuba. You show off how well you're doing as an immigrant, whether it's true or not. And so these are characteristics of our societies. I mean, it's not something that is even unique to Cuba, but it does it does nurture the spirit of leaving. It's going to be better. There's poverty in the U.S., but it's not going to affect me. And in fact, Cubans are much better, in much better capacity to live the American dream, or at least to be better off because of our education, our health, our the things that the Haitians lack, or the Mexicans lack, or the Nicaraguans lack. And so, yeah, they go there, and in a few, years, they are making money. They are buying a house. They are, working. They do open up a small business. And the professionals are, hey, they're doctors and they're nurses and they're engineers and they're architects in U.S. companies right away. And then they say, wow, this Cuban architect really knows his stuff. And why he's recommending from Cuba, I'm going to hire her because she's got to be as good as him. And she is, And so, for the Cuban immigrant with all the privileges that the revolution, which they decry and talk badly about, gives them the edge over the other immigrants. Like the Chinese or the Koreans or the Indians. They're similar, but very different from the Latin Americans.
They have an edge on getting into. Somebody just the other day was talking about how at the Mexican border they're letting the Cuban immigrants in now.
Yeah, because Obama took away the dry foot, wet foot, but the Cuban Adjustment Act is still in the books, which means that you spend a year there and 1 day, and there you can apply for your residence. Can you imagine saying that to the Colombians? If you spend a year here and 1 day, 366 days, then you can apply for U.S. residency, and in 3 to 5 years, U.S. citizenship. It's a huge magnet, obviously, and that's still in the books because the Congress would have to take away the Cuba Adjustment Act, and so.
Well, if the Democrats were smart, which they aren't, so much of the anti-immigrant thing of the Republican Party is open, and they don't want citizenship, so they'll all vote, and a lot of them will vote Democrat. They'll let the Cubans because the Cubans aren't going to vote Democrat.
That's sad.
And Democrats are so stupid.
That is so sad. A lot of the young Cubans are actually voting Republican and praising Trump and everything. The young Cubans, people who were raised here, formed here, who became professionals or became, skilled workers here. And it pains me so because I think that it's so unfair. And so, my mother-in-law was what they call Spanish Civil War children. Those are the children that fled the Spanish Civil War when Franco took over. They had to leave because their parents were Republican and they were either killed in the war or they were imprisoned. And she came to Cuba as an 8-year-old girl with her brothers and sisters and her mother. Her father was never heard of again, and when in the 1990s, it was actually proven that he was killed and thrown over a cliff by the government of Franco. And she would go to Miami and see her family that had immigrated to Miami and who were bitching about Cuba and talking about Cuba. And she said, we Spaniards, we have different political inclinations, but we never speak bad about our country. I can't understand how you that grew up in Cuba, that were benefited from the Cuban system, now have such hate and speak so badly about your country. I can't understand it. And I have a real hard time. I mean, my parents they left, and my family and my social class were against the revolution because we were the ones whose interests were affected by the revolution, by socialization, by nationalization, by the end of Catholic schools, for example. But we didn't live the benefits. We didn't benefit from the revolution. Yeah. So, in some sense, the resentment against the revolution made some sense. Yeah, you were the displaced class. But the ones that are arriving now and have been arriving for the last 10 years are the benefited class of the revolution. And they're not all of them, but a lot. And what happens to my son, I don't want to go to Miami. I don't want to live in Miami. Not discrimination. What's the other word there? Everybody is forced to have a single opinion. In Cuba, you can talk about against the government, maybe not in a demonstration, but at home with your neighbors, with your friends. Nobody, discriminates you against that. But in Miami, in the Cuban community, there is no space for anybody that does not attack Cuba or speak badly of Cuba. I'll stay in LA. I can do my film, and he has a lot of beefs and he has a lot of criticism and everything else, but he's not willing to be part of that mass of people that are just talking badly about Cuba and the revolution.
Is he part of the LA Cuba Solidarity group? Does he have something?
You know what happens is that these young people, even when they are not aggressively against Cuba, they are reticent of joining the solidarity movement for Cuba. And so I find, I may talk to them. I say, look, there's a march, a Puente de Amor, in LA and whatever. So, he's not. His family's in Cuba. His family is revolutionary, and he doesn't have this hate. And he doesn't want to live among all these people with all these prejudices. But he doesn't go as far as to say, I'm going to support the revolution. He feels that he's part of that young intellectual, cultural movement in Cuba that hasn't been given enough freedom, has suffered from censure, which is true. It is true. In his college years, he did experience things like that, and he identifies with the artists and filmmakers and so on who demonstrate in front of the Ministry of Culture and say we want freedom, we want cultural freedom, we want academic freedom, we want and they still, it's a process. There's a lot more space than there used to be, even when he left 6 years ago. But there's a lot of beefs, and a lot of his friends are demonstrating in front, or at least me trying to meet with the authorities to demand more freedom. So he says, Dad, I'm not in your position. I have a lot of people that I know who are very critical of the Cuban government, particularly the spaces for expression, the freedom of expression, of cultural expression, and artists and filmmakers.
So then Silvio Rodriguez and his recent comments about Cuba, beloved figure Silvio Rodriguez, has recently said, we need after 60 years, can't we do something different? He's been pretty,
Yeah.
Are people going, wow, right on?
Yeah, I think a lot of people like myself, who, by the way, I'm a Silvio Rodriguez fan all the way, really resonate with that message, which is we need to make changes. We need to go forward faster. We need to open areas for debate and for dissent and expression of dissent. We need a law of demonstrations, so we know what we can demonstrate for or against, and how to do it peacefully and get recognition for the fact that there are different points of view. And so that's happened, say, for the animal rights movement, for the LGBTQ, all those letters movement. Okay, there are spaces that have opened up in particular sectors, but filmmakers, for example, are still, do still feel that there's limitation in terms of their and I would say that the films that have been made in the theater that has been staged in different years is a lot more, challenging of the state and of the state ideology than ever before. So I see the spaces open up, but they see the spaces that are still to be open. And in the terms of press and the capacity to express views in public you know, and the press is still all owned by the state, and it's still all controlled by the party. And there are differences. There are differences from one region to another, from one newspaper, from one TV, from one radio, and there's differences that denote a process of change. But it's still, there are areas in which there's still very little change. Any area that threatens the revolution, or the unity of the revolution, or the stability of the revolution is still very close. So I would say that people like Silvio have for years been challenging from within, and I've been challenging from within since I've been here. And it isn't always easy, but the thing is from within. That's the key word. When you are doing it from without, then you are out of the game. You're out of the capacity to really influence things.
What year did you move back again?
Pardon?
What year did you move back? You said,
In '86.
oh, long, okay, wow, a while ago, yes.
That's a long time ago.
That's a long time ago.
Okay.
So, hey, I think that we've gone a couple of hours. If it's
No,
okay.
we really appreciate all you've given us.
Yeah, thanks.
Shared, really.
Well, thank you. I hope, I think it's a real challenge to come to Cuba and understand what the hell's going on.
Yeah.
It really is. I mean, we live here and sometimes don't know very clearly what's going on. But I think that it's great that you can look objectively and have people like Rafael Hernandez who I work with in Temas, and other people that can give you a view that's not the party line, but it's the committed. It's the Silvio Rodriguez of Cuba. It's the people that are critical, that are committed. And that's the hope for this country, really, to be able to carry out the transformations that this country needs, to do it with the people staying here and working and making the sacrifices that need to, but also your individual satisfaction cannot be, I should say, the satisfaction of social needs cannot be at the expense of individual satisfaction. There has to be space for us to, to live comfortably and to express ourselves. And, when I go abroad and I come back and I say, I don't want to live anywhere else. Right now, really, truly, I don't want to live anywhere else. Because I'm used to it. And I'm used to the shortages and to the difficulty. Maybe it's because it's simpler life. It's just, I don't have to do all this bullshit, and I don't have to watch TV full of advertising or go through a city with billboards everywhere. I mean, it doesn't seem like anything to you, but where's the freedom for living? Where's my freedom where I have to, accept that I have a barrage of publicity and advertising to buy things? That's a constraint on my freedom. When you live like that every day, you don't think about it. Maybe most people don't think about it, but I say, oh, I'm so glad I'm here, and there's no billboards and there's no advertising, and there's, it may seem weird. Yeah.
I was just going to say though, our job though when we get back is not to talk about this stuff. It is to talk about the gains of the revolution and to really fight against the blockade and any U.S. intervention. That's our work.
That's your job.
That's our job.
So we should talk. It's good to talk about some of this a little bit too, because people will have that on their mind. Well, why did people demonstrate on July 11th?
Right.
Well, and
have you been able to ask those questions of the people that have? Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think it's important to understand why, and to understand what that means, know, and is that going to bring down the government?
Yeah, right. But I think our job
Okay.
is
And that's your job, and it's a really, and I think that we
Yeah.
really value it. That there are people like you in the States that are really trying to struggle a very difficult fight right now, a very difficult struggle. There are all kinds of challenges from the right, from the center, from everywhere.
From every
At least we're not Miami.
Yeah.
At least you're not in Miami.